Cash is disappearing, and the most important part is that it is disappearing quietly. Not with tanks in the street, not with a dramatic announcement that says your freedom ends here, but with policies, thresholds, and modernization slogans that sound harmless until the day you discover you have no alternative left. Look at the pattern. In parts of Europe, cash payments are legally capped so that anything too large must pass through a bank rail, leaving a permanent record and giving institutions the ability to delay, question, or block the transfer altogether. France, for example, limits most cash payments for residents to €1,000, pushing bigger purchases into traceable channels by default. Now zoom out. The United States doesn't ban cash outright, but it treats large cash activity as inherently suspicious. Deposit more than $10,000 in cash at a bank, and the system triggers mandatory reporting under anti-money laundering rules. The point is not that you did something wrong. The point is that the act of using physical money at scale automatically turns you into a data event. And then there is Sweden, routinely held up as the model of a frictionless future. In practice, a society that runs on cards and mobile apps is a society that runs on infrastructure you do not control. When the rails are up, life feels smooth. When the rails go down, the economy locks. Even supporters of cashless systems admit that the backup function of cash is real, because digital payment networks fail in normal, non-apocalyptic ways. Outages, cyber incidents, simple technical breakdowns. Cash is different. It is settlement you can hold. It does not require permission. It does not require a login, a device, a network connection, a payment processor, or a risk engine that decides your purchase looks unusual. When cash exists as a viable option, your economic life has an escape hatch. When that escape hatch shrinks, your freedom becomes conditional. That is the core idea. The war on cash is not mainly about convenience. It is about converting money from an object you possess into a service you access. And services always come with terms. Once you accept that frame, the next steps become easier to see. Cash limits. Expanding compliance reporting. The steady normalization of surveillance in the name of security. And finally, the push toward state-linked digital money designs, where rules can be embedded directly into how currency functions. Once cash begins to disappear, the nature of money itself changes. This is the part most people miss, because on the surface, nothing dramatic seems to happen. You still have a balance. You still get paid. You can still swipe a card or tap a phone. But beneath that familiarity, money stops being something you own and becomes something you access. Cash settles a transaction immediately. When you hand it over, the exchange is final. No intermediary can reverse it, delay it, or question the intent behind it. Digital money works differently. Every transaction becomes a request, routed through layers of infrastructure: banks, payment processors, clearing systems, compliance engines, and increasingly, algorithmic risk models. Your money moves only if every layer agrees. That difference matters because control lives in friction. When money is physical, friction is logistical. When money is digital, friction is political and administrative. It can be increased or decreased instantly, without changing the currency itself, simply by changing the rules around access. This is where the real mechanism of control emerges. Digital systems do not need to ban behavior outright. They only need to make certain actions slow, expensive, suspicious, or impossible to approve. A transaction flagged for review is functionally blocked, even if it is technically legal. An account marked as high risk exists, but it no longer fully works. Once all money flows through permissioned rails, enforcement becomes quiet. There is no confrontation, no visible punishment. There is only denial of service. Your payment fails. Your account is frozen pending investigation. Your transfer is delayed indefinitely. The system never says you are guilty. It simply withholds functionality. This is why digital money scales control so efficiently. It does not rely on police, courts, or prisons. It relies on code and compliance. And code does not argue. It executes. The deeper issue is programmability. Cash does not care how long you hold it, where you spend it, or what you buy. Digital currency can be designed to care about all of those things. It can expire. It can be limited to approved merchants. It can be restricted by geography. It can be conditioned on behavior. None of this requires new laws once the infrastructure exists. It requires policy updates. This is not theoretical. Financial systems already embed conditionality. Welfare payments are restricted to certain uses. Corporate accounts are monitored for unusual activity. Sanctions regimes instantly render assets unusable. The only difference is scale. As long as cash exists, these tools apply selectively. When cash disappears, they apply universally. And then there is data. Every digital transaction generates metadata. Time, location, merchant, category, frequency. Over time, this data stops being about payments and starts becoming about people. Spending patterns reveal habits. Habits reveal beliefs. Beliefs become risk indicators. Risk indicators become justifications. This is how economic profiling replaces legal process. No one needs to accuse you of anything. The system only needs to decide you are outside acceptable norms. Once that happens, access narrows. Limits appear. Reviews multiply. Life becomes administratively heavy. Cash breaks this chain because it produces no data trail. It creates no profile. It offers no predictive leverage. That is why it is incompatible with a governance model built on preemption rather than reaction. Digital systems aim to intervene before something goes wrong. Cash allows action without prior approval. Those two logics cannot coexist comfortably. So when cash is framed as outdated, what is really being criticized is its resistance to control. It refuses to integrate. It refuses to report. It refuses to optimize. And in a system that values visibility above all else, that refusal looks like a threat. This is the moment where money stops being neutral. It becomes an instrument, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, procedural way. And once money becomes an instrument of governance, economic freedom becomes conditional by design, not by exception. At this stage, the question is no longer what is happening to money, but who benefits from the transformation. Because systems do not evolve on their own. They are shaped by institutions with incentives, constraints, and power. Start with governments. Modern states are no longer financed primarily through direct taxation alone. They are financed through debt. Bonds must be issued, rolled over, serviced, and stabilized. This creates a permanent dependence on smooth financial plumbing. Any large pool of money that sits outside the banking system weakens that plumbing. Cash does exactly that. It escapes interest rates. It escapes liquidity management. It escapes behavioral nudges. From a debt-driven state's perspective, cash is dead weight. Central banks sit at the center of this structure. Their mandate is framed in neutral language: price stability, financial stability, employment. But the tools they use are blunt and indirect. They do not command people to spend or save. They shape incentives. And incentives only work if people cannot opt out. Cash is the opt-out. It allows people to ignore negative rates, ignore consumption pressure, ignore certain forms of policy transmission altogether. That is why the long-term direction is so consistent across countries with very different political systems. Liberal democracies, technocracies, and authoritarian states all converge on the same conclusion. Money must become more legible, more controllable, more programmable, not because they share ideology, but because they share constraints. Then there are banks. Commercial banks are not neutral custodians of money. They are leveraged institutions whose survival depends on confidence and access to liquidity. Deposits are not stored. They are used. When money exists only digitally, banks gain a captive base. When money can be withdrawn as cash at scale, banks face discipline. That discipline is uncomfortable. It limits risk-taking. It limits policy experiments. It limits how far authorities can push the system without triggering visible stress. Remove cash, and that discipline weakens. Bail-ins become feasible. Negative rates become enforceable. Capital controls become surgical instead of blunt. From an institutional standpoint, this is not oppression. It is stability. Payment processors and financial technology firms form the next layer. They are often portrayed as neutral infrastructure, but they operate under regulatory pressure and reputational risk. Their business model depends on compliance. When everything flows through them, they become enforcement nodes. They do not need to agree with policy. They only need to follow it. When they cut access, the effect is immediate and total. Above all of this sits data. Data is the real prize. In a cash-based world, Economic activity is noisy and incomplete. In a digital-only world, it becomes clean, analyzable, predictable. Patterns emerge. Populations can be segmented. Behavior can be nudged at scale. This is not conspiracy. It is management logic. Once money becomes data, governance becomes optimization. The goal is not punishment. The goal is alignment. Systems are designed to encourage good behavior and discourage risky behavior. But those categories are not fixed. They are defined by policy priorities, which change over time. History shows how this plays out. In the Soviet Union, cash restrictions were justified as planning tools. The result was a massive parallel economy. In post-collapse Russia, trust in money evaporated entirely, and people reverted to barter and tangible value. In every case, when official systems became too rigid, people routed around them. What is different now is technological reach. There is no longer a need to ban alternatives openly. They can simply be made impractical. Cash does not have to be illegal to be unusable. If merchants stop accepting it, if banks discourage handling it, if limits shrink year by year, the result is the same without the political cost of prohibition. This is the quiet genius of the modern approach. There is no dramatic moment. No announcement that freedom has ended. Only a steady narrowing of options until compliance becomes the only viable path. From the perspective of power, this is not abuse. It is efficiency. From the perspective of the individual, it is dependency. And dependency, once normalized, rarely feels like control. It feels like reality. That is the map of actors and incentives behind the war on cash. Not villains plotting in secret rooms, but systems converging on the same solution because it makes governance easier, risk more manageable, and behavior more predictable. The danger is not intention. The danger is inevitability. Every system built on control eventually encounters its own limits. Not because people suddenly rebel, but because complexity creates fragility. The same mechanisms that make a cashless financial system efficient also make it brittle, and that brittleness is where the war on cash begins to reveal its breaking points. The first fracture appears when trust erodes. Digital money only works if users believe access will remain stable. The moment that belief weakens, behavior changes. People stop saving. They stop planning. They look for exits. History shows this pattern repeatedly. When money feels conditional, people treat it as temporary. And temporary money does not anchor an economy. This is where negative interest rates matter. In a system with cash, negative rates are self-limiting. People withdraw. They store value physically. They opt out. In a system without cash, negative rates become enforceable policy. Savings slowly drain. Holding money becomes a liability. The intended effect is to force spending and stimulate growth. The unintended effect is the destruction of long-term trust. Once saving feels unsafe, people stop thinking in years and start thinking in days. Economic horizons shrink. Productivity suffers. Risk-taking becomes defensive rather than creative. This is not theoretical. Parts of Europe have already seen how prolonged negative rate environments distort behavior. Removing cash removes the last pressure valve. The second fracture is operational failure. Digital systems fail in mundane ways. Power outages, software bugs, cyber incidents, network congestion. None of these require catastrophe. They happen routinely. In a mixed system, cash absorbs the shock. Transactions continue. In a cashless system, failure cascades instantly. Commerce stops. Essentials become inaccessible. The efficiency of centralization turns into systemic paralysis. These failures expose a deeper problem. Resilience was traded for optimization. Cash is inefficient. It is expensive to print, transport, and secure. But it is robust. It does not depend on uptime. When resilience is removed in the name of efficiency, the system becomes dependent on perfection. Perfection does not exist. The third fracture is exclusion. Digital-only systems assume universal access. Bank accounts, identification, connectivity, literacy. In reality, millions of people exist at the margins. Migrants, elderly populations, informal workers, rural communities. Cash allows participation without onboarding. Digital systems require compliance before access. As cash disappears, Exclusion becomes normalized, not as cruelty, but as procedure. Accounts cannot be opened. Payments cannot be accepted. Livelihoods shrink. The system does not see people. It sees missing data, and missing data is treated as risk. The fourth fracture is politicization. Once money becomes programmable, pressure builds to use that power. Emergencies justify exceptions. Exceptions become precedent. What begins as targeted control expands. First against criminals, then against undefined harmful behavior, then against dissent framed as risk. At that point, the system does not need to be authoritarian to behave authoritatively. Enforcement is automated. Responsibility is diffused. No one is making a moral choice. The system is simply applying rules. Dax in the face of classed off. History warns what happens next. Parallel economies emerge. Informal trade resurfaces. Barter returns. Alternative stores of value appear. Gold, foreign currency, goods, favors, anything that escapes the rails. Governments respond by tightening further. Control increases, trust decreases. The spiral accelerates. This is the paradox. Eliminating cash is supposed to eliminate shadow economies. In practice, it creates them. The more rigid the official system becomes, the more incentive people have to route around it. Control breeds evasion. Visibility breeds opacity elsewhere. The final breaking point is legitimacy. When people no longer believe money belongs to them, they stop respecting the system that issues it. Compliance becomes performative. Loyalty disappears. Stability becomes fragile, maintained only by constant intervention. This is where the war on cash risks undermining its own goals. Financial control without trust is not stability. It is stasis, and stasis is brittle. The system does not collapse dramatically. It hollows out. It continues to function, but it no longer commands belief. And without belief, no monetary system survives indefinitely. When a financial system loses cash, the consequences do not arrive as a single shock. They spread outward, quietly, through daily life. The effects are not felt first by institutions, but by individuals, because individuals have the fewest buffers and the least leverage. The most immediate change is psychological. Money stops feeling owned and starts feeling leased. People may not articulate it this way, but they sense it. They become cautious in ways that are hard to measure. Purchases are second-guessed. Donations decline. Spontaneous economic activity shrinks. When every transaction leaves a trail, discretion disappears. This alters behavior in subtle but profound ways. People begin to self-censor economically. They avoid purchases that might look unusual. They hesitate to support causes that could be misinterpreted. They choose conformity over preference, not because anyone told them to, but because the system made deviation uncomfortable. For those already at the margins, the effects are harsher. A missed document, a flagged transaction, a frozen account. In a cashless environment, these are not inconveniences. They are existential threats. Rent cannot be paid. Food cannot be purchased. Transportation stops. There is no workaround. No informal bridge. No fallback. This is where financial exclusion turns into social exclusion. Economic participation becomes conditional on constant compliance. A single error can cascade into isolation. And because enforcement is procedural, not personal, there is often no one to appeal to. The system does not explain itself. It simply enforces. Communities that rely on informal exchange suffer disproportionately. Cash supports neighbor-to-neighbor economies. Childcare paid quietly. Small repairs. Day labor. Gifts. Mutual aid. These networks are invisible but essential. When transactions must be digital, they must be formalized. Formalization introduces friction. Friction dissolves trust. Trust dissolves networks. Over time, social capital erodes. Relationships that once included economic reciprocity become purely symbolic. Help becomes charity rather than exchange. Dependency replaces interdependence. Privacy loss compounds this effect. Spending data becomes a proxy for identity. Algorithms infer beliefs, habits, risks. Insurance pricing adjusts. Credit access shifts. Employment screening incorporates financial behavior. The line between economic life and personal life disappears. This creates a new form of inequality, not just between rich and poor, but between those who fit the model and those who do not. Compliance becomes a form of capital. Predictability becomes valuable. Deviance becomes costly. The most dangerous consequence, however, is learned helplessness. When people realize that access to basic needs can be revoked instantly, without due process, they adapt by lowering expectations. They do not push boundaries. They do not resist. They minimize exposure. This is not fear in the dramatic sense. It is caution normalized. Over time, it reshapes culture. Risk aversion increases. Innovation declines. Civic engagement weakens. A population that depends on permission for every transaction becomes administratively obedient, even without overt repression. At the same time, responsibility shifts. When money fails someone, institutions point to compliance requirements. When accounts are frozen, terms of service are cited. The language of governance disappears behind legal disclaimers. Control is depersonalized. The result is a society that appears orderly, efficient, and stable, but is internally brittle. People comply not because they agree, but because alternatives no longer exist. Stability is maintained by dependency, not trust. Cash once absorbed shocks at the individual level. It allowed people to survive disruptions, errors, and transitions. Removing it transfers all risk upward to centralized systems. When those systems fail, they fail completely. This is why the war on cash is not just a monetary issue. It is a social architecture shift. It redefines autonomy, community, and resilience. And it does so without ever asking for consent. Because the change is framed as inevitable. By the time the consequences are fully visible, the infrastructure that once allowed resistance has already been dismantled. So what does all of this amount to? When the pieces are placed together without slogans or euphemisms, the war on cash is not a sudden attack. It is a long transition in how power is exercised. Physical money represented a limit. A line the system could not easily cross. It gave individuals a small but meaningful zone of autonomy, a way to transact, survive, and adapt without constant permission. Removing cash removes that limit. What replaces it is not chaos, but order. Clean, optimized, administratively elegant order. Money becomes a managed environment rather than a possessed object. Participation becomes conditional rather than assumed. Access replaces ownership. And once that shift is complete, freedom does not need to be taken away. It simply expires. History is clear on one point. Societies that lose economic autonomy eventually lose political and social autonomy as well. Not because leaders are evil, but because systems that centralize control naturally expand it. Each crisis justifies another safeguard. Each safeguard narrows the margin of choice. And over time, the extraordinary becomes normal. This does not mean cashless systems will collapse tomorrow. They may function for years, even decades, but they will function by trading resilience for compliance, trust for monitoring, autonomy for efficiency. That trade is rarely debated honestly, because it sounds abstract until it becomes personal. The crucial question is not whether digital money is coming. It is. The question is whether people understand what is being exchanged in the process. Convenience is not free, security is not neutral, and modernization is not automatically progress. Once money can be programmed, restricted, frozen, or revoked, power no longer needs force. It needs infrastructure. And infrastructure, once built, is very hard to dismantle. Cash was never just paper. It was an exit, a backup, a reminder that economic life did not require constant approval. When it disappears, the system does not announce victory. It simply becomes permanent. And permanence is the real weapon. If this analysis gave you a different way of seeing money, stay with this channel. These systems have histories, patterns, and warning signs. And understanding them is the first step toward recognizing where real power now lives.